Unit 3 focuses on creating tables and adding them into websites. So what we'll look at over the next couple of lessons are some of the table vocabulary, how we plan out a table, how tables can be used, and then we'll actually plan out how we can code them, and we'll talk about what that coding actually looks like. So this whole unit focuses on creating tables and using them within a website. So lesson 1 focuses on the table elements themselves as well as how to plan a table. And this particular lesson is broken into 2 videos. This first video will focus on the table elements, and then the second video will focus on how to actually plan out those tables to be used in HTML documents. On the screen, you'll see the 4 learning targets that you should be able to apply by the end of this lesson. The first is that you can describe the elements of a web page table. The second are that you can describe the different types of table cells and the different cell attributes that can be used to format a table. You'll then be able to format table cells, and then finally in the second video we'll talk about planning, designing, and coding of a web page table. Similar to the other units, we're going to be creating an in-class project together throughout this unit, and the next few slides are going to outline what that project is going to look like when our website is complete, and it focuses on the Bell Video website. On the screen, you'll see a brief overview of what this website is going to look like and some of the things that it will utilize. You'll notice that we have 4 pages. We will create both the home page and the new releases page, and then we'll modify the actors and the type page. So I'll give you a file to download, and then we'll modify those in order to create a website that contains those pages that are updated and displaying information correctly. This is being made for the Bell video rental store, and so all of these pages will be related to that. And every single page makes use of tables to display information. So we'll explore a variety of ways to utilize tables, as well as a variety of ways of how to format tables so that they look nice and display information appropriately on the screen. So on the screen right now, you'll see the Bell Video homepage. And you'll notice that we use tables right here for the 2 images. So we have 1 cell here and 2 cells here. And then you'll notice there's a second table down below that has 2 cells as well. 1 cell for that menu bar that you see, that vertical menu bar, and a second cell for the text describing the Bell Video website. So we will create this entire thing together, and I'll show you where to download some of those images and etc. when we get to lesson 2 and 3. And now you'll see the new releases page that we also will create together. You'll notice a couple of different types of tables. This first table right here doesn't have a border, but it creates a horizontal menu bar. And then you can see a second table down below that describes movie titles, their actors, and a description. So again, we will create this entire thing together, and we'll walk through how to format and design 2 different types of tables, one with a horizontal menu bar and another that displays groups of information. This is the actor page that we'll be modifying, and we'll be adding things in like cell spacing, cell padding, and table captions. And then this is the type page that we'll be modifying, and you'll notice that it has a different type of table that contains things called spanning. So you'll notice this cell spans 3 columns, this cell spans 3 rows, this cell spans 2 columns. So we'll talk through how we actually create tables that have cells that span and how the planning process behind them is slightly more challenging. The next slides are going to outline some key vocabulary used when creating web pages that contain tables. So a table at its most basic definition is simply something that allows you to organize information, and really it allows you to take text and take images and arrange them in such a way that they can be viewed and read and interpreted really easily. So really tables just allow you to organize and to have more control over the formatting and the display of information on your web page. Now a cell in a table is simply an individual element in the table. So for example, if I were to create a really basic table over here, this table would contain 6 cells. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells. So that's just each individual area within a table. And these can be really, really simple grids of information. It can just be text with no color and no formatting. but they can also be complex with things like cell spanning. You can have borders, you can add colors, you can add spacing. So these can be as simple or complex as you want, and you can program a table in a web page by its table. You can program it by row, and you can actually individualize each and every cell if you choose to do so. So on the screen, you'll see a really simple example of a table that contains really no formatting whatsoever. You'll notice that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different rows, a good number of different columns, and there's no formatting involved. The cells are all as big as they need to be to hold the text inside of them. They're all aligned to the left, and it's just really, really simple. There's no color, there's no border formatting, there's nothing. Now here's the same set of information, but we've added in some formatting with the cells. So you'll notice here that this single cell has a background of blue, has some bigger text that's bolded. You'll notice there's a grayish background along this row. You'll notice that this particular cell spans all of these rows, and this one spans all of these columns. So you'll notice that just by adding in a little bit of formatting and a little bit of spanning and a little bit of color, it actually makes this table much easier to view, easier to read, and easier to interpret. Now we'll start this particular unit by just learning how to make those simpler tables, but we will get to a point where we can make a table that's more complex with more formatting. So note that we'll start simple and then we'll gradually build to these more complex tables. There are quite a few different applications for tables, and one of the most popular ones is it's simply a really, really easy way to wrap text around images. And I know that we've talked about image wrapping and how we can get the alignment so that the text wraps around it perfectly, but a table makes it really, really easy. So if you look down here, you can see you have a table, one of those cells, it's a one row table. One of those cells contains text, a second cell contains the image, and it's a really, really easy way to assure that everything is perfectly lined up. So if you use no border, it really just blends right into the background of your web page. So this is the first application, and while it seems really simple, it does make your life quite a bit easier, just helping you to wrap text around an image. A second application of a table is that it can be used to actually give images what looks like a frame. So if you use a border appropriately, it can act like a frame for this picture. So you'll notice this is a one row, one column table, and it has this image of a bird on a quilt in that table, but then if you make the border thick enough, if you make it thick enough to be like 50 pixels, 100 pixels, maybe even just 15 in this case, you'll notice that it gives it what looks like a frame around that image, but can make the image pop out a little bit more, stand out a little bit more, and appear nicer on your page. So a second application is to frame images. So throughout the last few slides, we're just going to talk about some key table elements and then some attributes that can be used within a table row, and within a table cell in order to format them appropriately. So a couple of key vocabulary words to be aware of when dealing with table elements. The first is that a row is a horizontal line of information. So how I remember this is I say, okay, a row boat is horizontally long so that it can fit people in there. So it's horizontally long, and as a result, a row is a horizontal chunk of information in a table. A column then is the opposite, and I start thinking of like the columns in Rome, and I know that those are long, tall, stone pieces of architecture in Rome. So I know that those are tall landmarks there, and then as a result, a column is a vertical chunk of information in a table. Now, a cell, on the other hand, is just one single entry, and a cell occurs when there's an intersection of a row and a column. And something to note is that each of these can be formatted with different text types, different colors, bolded fonts, things like that. And we're going to talk through that on the next few pages. But things that you really need to note to move forward in this chapter: a row is horizontal and a column is vertical, with a cell then being an intersection of the two and a single entry in a table. So an example of some of the different stylings that you can use within a table, you'll notice here that all of these cells in the first row are bolded and centered in alignment, while the rest of the table does not appear to be that way. You'll also notice here that this row is shaded yellow, and we can do that. We can just have one row have a specific color, maybe to highlight, okay, this is an area of focus in this table. While the rest of the information is important, this shaded piece is incredibly important. And then on the flip side, the same table, maybe we want to focus all in on the department, so instead of highlighting a row and having that row contain a specific colored background, we can also program our table so that a column has a very specific colored background as well. And finally, maybe we really just want one piece of that whole table to stand out, just one cell, and we can do that as well. We can change the formatting within just one singular cell in a table. So as you notice in the previous tables, that first line, that first row of information had different formatting that belonged to it. And that's because we actually have two different types of data cells that we can add into our table. So one of them is called the heading cell. And if we use a heading cell, and this uses the TH tag, if we use this heading cell, it will actually automatically display things as bold and centered. And normally, the first row of a table you want to be different because that's kind of headings for the rest of the information in your table. So again, it will automatically display it as bold and center aligned. Now a normal data cell, which is something that's as expected, it's a simple piece of information, one chunk of information in a cell in a table. If you don't want this to be bolded and centered because it's just mixed in with the regular data, you use a data cell, and as a result it will have normal text and will be left aligned. So here on this screen you can see we have a couple of heading cells. So here's one heading cell, here's another. Anything that's bolded and centered aligned is a heading cell. And then the rest of these actually are all data cells. You notice that they're normal text, they're left aligned. All of these down here below those green cells, every single one is a data cell that is used just to include data on the table. So you can notice a clear difference, the heading cells and their purpose versus the data cells and their purpose. Now as we start diving into tables, something that we really need to note are that tables are created row by row. You may really need to make yourself a note of this because what you'll notice as we start coding tables in lessons 2, 3, and 4 are that they are all coded row by row. And what that means is that you plan it out by knowing how many rows your table has to have, and then you add cells from that way. Now as a result, because of this, cell attributes can be set for an entire row by using something called the TR tag, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. You can put cell attributes for just a single cell by putting it within the TH or the TD tags that we'll talk about again in just a second. And then you can do one or more cells within a row, but you'll have to program them by going into that specific cell. So because tables are programmed row by row, you can only set things for an entire row, for a single cell, or for multiple cells. You cannot set a format for a column in one singular tag. That will not be something that we'll be able to do, and you'll see why once we start our actual coding. So some key formatting words to be aware of as we start progressing through this chapter. A table border is a line that encloses the perimeter of the table, so that's that outer line around the table. So when we're talking about changing the width of our border, we're talking about changing that outer line that surrounds our table. A table heading is something that's used to identify what's in the contents of your table, and oftentimes you use what's called spanning for these headings, and again we'll talk about that in a later lesson. And then a table caption, which we will do later on as well, is a descriptive text that's located above or below the table that further describes the purpose or meaning of the table. So what I mean by that is this text is often in italics and really just highlights the purpose of that table with a couple of words. It shouldn't be an entire paragraph, but it's just, a fragment of information that's used to clarify the purpose of the table or what the information in the table actually represents. So you can see a couple of different things within this table here. You can see the border that outlines the outside of the table, and that goes all the way around. You can see a table heading that spans some rows and another table heading that spans some columns. And you can also see the caption down here at the very bottom, giving some clarifying information about the purpose of that table and what those numbers actually represent. So you can see those key table vocabulary terms right there in the table on your screen. So the final thing we're going to talk about in this particular video is something called the rules attribute, and this is used to create a horizontal or vertical line within a table. So we've all seen tables before. You can see the different rules. There are these lines on the inside, so I'll make those lines different colors. So these lines that have some highlight in green, those are called the rules, and we have three different options for the rules. We have no rules, which would take all of those lines out of there. We have column rules, which will just show the vertical lines that are between the columns. And then we have the rows rule, which would just show the horizontal lines that are between the rows. So on your screen, you see an example of one with a columns rule. So you can see here that we have rules between the various columns, but that the rows do not. And normally the purpose of selecting only specific rows are to help highlight information. So maybe we want to really highlight the people, and then we can see their scores directly beneath them. And then in contrast to the previous slide, we can have a rows attribute value for our rules. And what that does is it just puts lines between all of the rows. And what this may do is it may help us highlight, okay, we want to just look at exam 1 scores, exam 2 scores, exam 3 scores. You can see that depending on the rules that we use, it really does make information pop differently. So you'll have to think through the purpose of your table and what information you want the users of your website to see.